She showed up to the interview covered in mud. Everyone laughed until the CEO walked in. "Subscribe and tell me in the comments what city you're from." The first light of dawn barely touched the horizon, casting a pale gray wash over the crumbling rooftops of Southside, the part of the city most residents preferred to forget. In this pocket of neglect, amidst the potholed streets and graffiti-stained walls, Aaliyah woke to the shrill cry of her alarm clock. She blinked against the dimness of her small, cluttered room, the peeling wallpaper curling at the corners like dying leaves. Stretching stiffly, she sat up on her thin mattress, careful not to disturb the stack of textbooks piled precariously at its foot. The house was silent, save for the distant hum of traffic and the occasional creak of old pipes. Her mother must have already left for her first shift at the nursing home, and her younger brother was likely still asleep, curled into a ball against the chill that no amount of patchwork insulation could fully keep out. Aaliyah swung her legs off the bed and padded across the worn linoleum floor, pulling a faded sweatshirt over her head before tiptoeing into the kitchen. There wasn't much to eat. A few slices of bread, a nearly empty jar of peanut butter, but she made do, eating quickly, more out of necessity than hunger. Today was not a day for distractions. Today was different. Today was a day she had worked toward through endless late-night study sessions and early morning shifts at the corner store. Today was her interview at Whitmore and Lane, one of the city's most prestigious corporate firms, a place so far removed from her reality it might as well have existed on another planet. Her heart hammered with a mix of excitement and terror as she retrieved her carefully prepared outfit from the back of the closet. It wasn't much, an off-brand white blouse and a navy skirt she had bought second-hand, but it was clean, pressed, and respectable. She inspected it closely, brushing away a few stray threads, smoothing out invisible wrinkles. In the cracked mirror hanging above the kitchen sink, she adjusted the collar, studying her reflection with a critical eye. Her deep brown skin, framed by tightly coiled hair she had wrestled into a neat bun, glowed with determination. She wasn't naive. She knew appearances mattered in places like Whitmore and Lane, but she also knew she carried something deeper, something that couldn't be ironed into fabric or bought at a boutique: grit. She packed her resume into a thin plastic sleeve to protect it from the rain forecasted to fall throughout the day. Every page represented sleepless nights, sacrifices, and an unyielding belief that she could carve out a place for herself beyond Southside. Slinging her worn backpack over one shoulder, she kissed her brother's forehead gently and slipped out into the gray, drizzling morning. The streets shimmered under the weak light, puddles stretching like thin sheets of glass. The smell of damp concrete filled the air. Aaliyah pulled up the hood of her sweatshirt and began the long walk to the bus stop. She checked her battered phone for updates. The bus was supposed to come at 6:15 sharp. She glanced nervously at the heavy clouds overhead, willing them to hold back just a little longer. By the time she reached the stop, the rain had intensified into a steady downpour, and the streets glistened under its relentless assault. Aaliyah huddled under the flimsy shelter, clutching her resume against her chest. Minutes ticked by. 6:15 came and went. 6:20, 6:25. Her stomach twisted with anxiety. Around her, the handful of other commuters began to murmur in irritation, checking their phones and watches. Then came the notification that gutted her. City Transit, strike begins at 6 a.m. Expect major delays or cancellations. Panic gripped her for a moment. She looked around helplessly as others began to drift away, cursing under their breath. No buses, no taxis in sight, No one wanted to drive into Southside if they could help it. Her interview was scheduled for 8:30 sharp on the opposite side of the city, a distance too far to walk in her best shoes, even under ideal conditions. But these were not ideal conditions. Aaliyah swallowed hard against the lump rising in her throat. She couldn't give up. Not now. She adjusted the backpack on her shoulder, wiped the rain from her eyes, and set off on foot, ignoring the way the water seeped into her shoes almost immediately. Each step splashed through growing rivers along the sidewalks. Her breath puffed white in the cold air as she walked faster, her heart racing not from exertion but from desperation. The further she went, the more hostile the weather became. Winds whipped the rain sideways, drenching her despite her hood. She clutched her resume tighter, sheltering it beneath her sweatshirt. As she passed into the more industrial parts of the city, she found herself navigating around abandoned warehouses and fenced-off lots, the way ahead a maze of puddles and construction detours. Aaliyah glanced at the time, 7:10. She still had a chance if she kept moving. Her legs burned, her toes numb with cold, but she pressed on. Every so often, she would catch her reflection in a shop window, drenched, bedraggled, small, and force herself to look away. Keep moving, keep moving. When she reached the midpoint of her journey, the neighborhoods shifted. The sidewalks here were broader, cleaner, the cars newer, the faces whiter. She quickened her pace, keenly aware of every glance cast in her direction, but she didn't have the luxury of caring about appearances now. That was when she saw her. An elderly woman, frail and bent, struggling to push her wheelchair up a flooded curb. Bags of groceries dangled precariously from the chair's handles, dragging it backward as the woman fought to gain traction. The water gushed around the wheels, threatening to topple her. Aaliyah's steps slowed. Every instinct screamed at her to keep going. She was already late, soaked, miserable, and barely hanging on. Helping would cost her precious minutes she couldn't afford. She tightened her grip on the resume. The woman's foot slipped, and she stumbled with a cry, barely catching herself on the slick, uneven pavement. Aaliyah didn't think anymore. She ran. The water was icy as it flooded her sneakers, soaking her to the skin, but she plunged into the street without hesitation. The woman gasped in fear as the chair tilted dangerously. Aaliyah dropped her resume into her backpack and grabbed the wheelchair with both hands, digging her heels into the ground. It took all her strength to steady the chair and push it back up onto the sidewalk. "Thank you, child," the woman rasped, shivering under her threadbare coat. Aaliyah didn't wait for gratitude. She pulled the woman's groceries into her own arms and helped guide her up the narrow walkway to the entrance of a weather-beaten apartment building nearby. She set the bags down just inside the door, offering the woman a smile before backing away. Only then did she take stock of herself. Mud streaked her skirt and blouse. Her shoes squelched with every step, heavy with filth and debris. Her hair, once neatly tied, had escaped its confines, plastered to her forehead in dripping coils. The cold clung to her skin, sinking deep into her bones. She wanted to cry, wanted to scream at the injustice of it all. She had done the right thing, and now her dream was slipping through her fingers like the rain down the gutters. But she couldn't stop now. Wiping her face on the sleeve of her ruined blouse, she checked the time. 7:30. If she ran, she might just make it. She couldn't let this morning be for nothing. Her family was counting on her. She was counting on herself. Squaring her shoulders against the biting wind, Aaliyah turned and ran. The city blurred around her. The sleek high-rises and boutique cafes, the disinterested stares of passers-by. Her wet clothes clung to her like a second skin. Her teeth chattered with every breath, but she didn't slow down. Not when her dream was so close, even as it seemed to slip further from her grasp with every step. She didn't know yet that the hardest part of her journey was still ahead, and that the moment she pushed open the grand glass doors of Whitmore and Lane would not just change her life, but ripple through the lives of everyone who witnessed her arrival. Aaliyah pressed on, soaked, shivering, heart pounding not from fear, but from the desperate, burning hope that refused to die. The city seemed determined to resist her every step. The rain, relentless and biting, hammered against the concrete like nails against a coffin. Aaliyah's legs ached with exertion, each footfall heavy and squelching in her soaked shoes. Her lungs burned from the cold air as she pressed forward, weaving between pedestrians who either barely noticed her or shifted away with a disdainful wrinkle of their noses. The sleek, polished facades of downtown buildings rose around her like indifferent giants, their gleaming windows reflecting her bedraggled figure back at her with cruel clarity. She kept her head down, focusing on the rhythmic thud of her shoes on the wet pavement, the pulse of her determination louder than the beat of the rain. Somewhere ahead lay Whitmore and Lane, a symbol of everything she had fought for, everything she refused to surrender. The thought fueled her, stoked the embers of resolve deep within her chest, even as the cold gnawed at her fingers and soaked through every layer of clothing. It was, as she crossed another flooded intersection, her backpack clutched tightly against her chest, that a scene unfolded before her. Something so sudden, so urgent, that instinct overtook all thought. A few yards ahead, an elderly white woman in a battered wheelchair struggled against the force of the storm. Grocery bags hung precariously from the handles of her chair, tugged and buffeted by the wind, while the woman herself tried and failed to maneuver up a shallow curb onto the safety of the sidewalk. Her thin coat, no match for the rain, clung to her frail frame, and the water pooled around the wheels of her chair, creating a swift, filthy current that threatened to carry her away. People saw her. A man in a suit paused, frowned, then hurried past, his briefcase held protectively against his side. A woman in heels, struggling with an umbrella, glanced over once, then turned her back. A delivery cyclist swerved around her, cursing under his breath. No one stopped. No one so much as slowed. Aaliyah's heart lurched in her chest. She hesitated for a split second, the voices of panic and practicality screaming inside her mind. She was already late. She was already soaked. Her interview was slipping further and further away with every heartbeat. If she stopped now, if she delayed even another minute, it could cost her everything she had worked for. And yet, the old woman's wheelchair tipped precariously as the current caught it, one wheel lifting slightly off the ground. She clutched at the rims, her face contorted in fear, too weak to pull herself free. Aaliyah moved. She plunged into the street without thought, the water surging over her ankles, filling her shoes with icy weight. The current tugged at her legs, cold and swift, but she fought her way forward. Reaching the wheelchair, she braced herself against the slick pavement, gripping the wet handles with numbed fingers. "I've got you," she gasped, though the woman could barely hear her over the roar of the rain and the rush of water. The old woman's eyes, cloudy but wide with terror, met hers. Aaliyah planted her feet and pushed, her muscles straining, her soaked clothes dragging at her. Inch by inch, she maneuvered the chair up onto the sidewalk, out of the worst of the flood. It was a battle, a muddy, slippery war against the elements and the inertia of despair, but she refused to let go. When at last the wheels found purchase on the higher ground, Aaliyah nearly collapsed from relief. She knelt beside the woman, checking quickly to make sure she was unharmed. The woman nodded faintly, her lips moving in a whisper of thanks lost to the storm. Aaliyah looked around. They were still exposed, the rain pouring down with no mercy. Nearby, a recessed doorway offered a scant bit of shelter. Without waiting for permission, Aaliyah pulled the wheelchair toward it, ignoring the pain in her shoulders, the burning in her calves. Inside the small alcove, she propped the woman's groceries against the wall and took off her own backpack, sheltering it as best she could. She crouched down beside the wheelchair, brushing rainwater from the woman's face with the sleeve of her ruined blouse. "You're safe now," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Stay here until it lets up." The woman's hand, thin and trembling, closed around Aaliyah's wrist with surprising strength. She said something then, words Aaliyah couldn't fully catch, but the look in her eyes, the raw gratitude, said more than enough. Aaliyah smiled, a small, weary thing, and rose to her feet. Her entire body felt heavier now, her clothes sodden, clinging to her like chains. She glanced down at herself and nearly flinched. Mud splattered her skirt and blouse in dark, irregular patterns. Garbage clung to the soaked fabric. One sleeve was torn, dangling pitifully. Her hair had long since escaped its neat bun, now hanging in wet, tangled curls around her face. She smelled of sewage and rain and something sour she couldn't place. Her resume. Dear God, her resume. She fumbled with her backpack, pulling out the plastic sleeve. Mercifully, the papers inside were mostly dry, though the edges were damp, curling slightly. It was all she had to show for herself now. She checked her phone. 7:45. Panic flared again. The interview was at 8:30 sharp. She was at least 20 minutes from the building if she ran, maybe more given the state she was in. Aaliyah stood there for a moment, the rain drumming against the shelter's thin overhang, the weight of hopelessness pressing down on her harder than the storm. Most people would have given up. Most people would have turned around, accepted defeat, gone home to lick their wounds and curse their bad luck. But Aaliyah was not most people. She zipped up her backpack, straightened her shoulders, and stepped back into the deluge. The rain hit her like a wall, soaking her even further, if that was even possible. But she forced her legs into motion. Every step was a battle against the urge to stop, to cry, to scream in frustration. Her skirt slapped against her thighs, heavy and awkward. Her shoes squelched and slid on the slick sidewalks. The cold bit at her skin, 1,000 tiny knives against her shivering flesh. But she kept going. She thought of her mother, bent over after double shifts, her hands cracked and raw from endless work. She thought of her brother, his wide eyes filled with dreams he was too young to name. She thought of every door that had ever been slammed in her face. Every time someone had looked at her and seen nothing but her skin, her clothes, her address. Not today. Today she would not be invisible. Today she would be undeniable. The city blurred around her, a gray smear of rain and stone and fleeting faces. Horns blared, tires hissed against wet asphalt, and somewhere someone shouted, but it all faded into the pounding rhythm of her heart. She caught sight of the tower then, the gleaming monolith that housed Whitmore and Lane, its glass face catching what little light filtered through the storm. It stood like a fortress against the world, impassive and towering. Aaliyah's chest tightened with a mixture of awe and terror. She forced herself to move faster, her muscles screaming in protest. Her breath came in ragged gasps, each one a cloud of steam against the cold air. She stumbled once, catching herself on a lamp post, and pushed on, refusing to let anything slow her now. As she neared the building, the true weight of what she was about to do pressed down on her. She looked like hell. She knew it. She could feel the filth coating her skin, smell the stench clinging to her clothes. No amount of confidence could mask the reality of her appearance. And yet she would walk through those doors, because she had earned the right to be there. Because no storm, no accident, no prejudice would keep her from standing up and being seen. The revolving doors spun ahead of her, a steady, mechanical rhythm. Beyond them, the lobby glowed with sterile, expensive light. People in tailored suits moved with practiced grace, their shoes clicking smartly against polished marble floors. Aaliyah took one breath, deep and shuddering, and then she stepped forward. The moment her foot crossed the threshold, the world seemed to pause. Conversations stuttered and died. Heads turned. Silence, cold and sharp, fell over the lobby like a shroud. They saw her, every inch of her muddy, rain-soaked, trembling form. And Aaliyah, for all her fear, for all the humiliation burning hot in her chest, lifted her chin and walked forward. Because the rain might have broken her body, but it had not broken her spirit. Not today. Not ever. The lobby of Whitmore and Lane was a shrine to wealth and power. Towering columns of polished marble stretched toward a vaulted ceiling inlaid with intricate designs. The floors gleamed like mirrors beneath the soft golden lights, reflecting the pristine shoes of executives and visitors alike. Behind a sleek reception desk, a woman in a razor-sharp black blazer typed briskly, only lifting her eyes to glance at the entrance when the wet slap of heavy footsteps echoed through the vast space. Aaliyah's presence shattered the sterile perfection of the lobby like a rock through glass. Her sodden, mud-smeared figure drew every gaze, every smirk, every whispered comment. Her soaked clothes clung to her like a second skin, emphasizing her discomfort. Her shoes, heavy with grime, left dark, soggy footprints on the immaculate marble. Each step forward felt like an act of rebellion against the unspoken rules of this place, rules that said only the polished and pristine belonged. A man in an expensive suit wrinkled his nose and stepped aside as she passed. A young woman with perfectly coiffed hair leaned in close to her friend, murmuring something behind a manicured hand, both of them snickering as their eyes followed Aaliyah. She felt the weight of every glance, every judgment, burning against her skin like frostbite. Still, she kept walking, one foot stubbornly in front of the other, her resume clutched to her chest like a shield. At the reception desk, the woman behind the counter straightened, her expression freezing into polite neutrality that couldn't mask the flicker of disdain in her eyes. She opened her mouth, doubtless to ask Aaliyah to leave, but Aaliyah was faster, thrusting forward the plastic sleeve with trembling fingers. "I have an interview," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her body. 8:30, Whitmore and Lane, Human Resources Department. For a moment, the receptionist simply stared at her as if she were some strange, bedraggled creature that had wandered in from the storm. Then, with a barely concealed sigh, she accepted the sleeve, scanning the document with an exaggerated slowness. When she found the name on her list, her eyebrows lifted almost imperceptibly, and she forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Take the elevator to the 23rd floor," she said, her voice clipped and mechanical. "Someone will meet you there." Aaliyah nodded, reclaiming her resume with as much dignity as she could muster. She turned toward the bank of elevators, conscious of the stairs drilling into her back. Her wet sneakers squeaked against the marble, each sound magnified in the cavernous space. She kept her gaze forward, her chin lifted, her steps deliberate. Inside the elevator, she finally allowed herself a moment to sag against the cool metal wall. She squeezed her eyes shut, breathing deeply, willing her heart to slow its frantic pounding. The soft hum of the elevator ascending was almost soothing, a rare moment of stillness in the chaos that had become her morning. When the doors slid open with a muted chime, Aaliyah stepped out into a hallway lined with glass walls and framed awards. Everything gleamed here, from the pristine white walls to the silver nameplates mounted beside each door. The faint scent of expensive cologne and polished wood filled the air. Voices murmured behind closed conference room doors, smooth and confident. A young assistant in a navy pencil skirt and matching jacket approached, tablet in hand. She glanced at Aaliyah, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second before she recovered her professional mask. "This way, please," she said, her voice tight. Aaliyah followed her down the hall, past sleek offices where impeccably dressed professionals tapped away at laptops or spoke briskly into headsets. Through the glass, Aaliyah caught glimpses of tidy desks, gleaming awards, framed diplomas from Ivy League universities. Her own reflection followed her in the glass, soaked, shivering, mud-streaked, and she had to force herself not to look away. The assistant led her into a conference room that looked like something out of a business magazine. A massive table of dark wood polished to a mirror finish, surrounded by high-backed leather chairs. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, where the storm clouds still churned and brooded. Several candidates were already seated around the table. They glanced up as Aaliyah entered, and the expressions that flickered across their faces were a study in subtle cruelty. A smirk here, a raised eyebrow there, a pointed glance exchanged between two women in matching tailored suits. A young man in a charcoal gray blazer leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms and regarding her with thinly veiled amusement. Aaliyah ignored them. She moved to the far end of the table, away from the cluster of polished candidates, and sat down. The leather chair squeaked under her weight, the sound loud in the charged silence. A few moments later, the interview panel entered. 3 men and 2 women, all dressed in variations of the same crisp, muted elegance. At their center was an older man with silver hair and sharp blue eyes, wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit. His presence commanded the room effortlessly, and when his gaze swept over the candidates, the murmurs ceased immediately. Aaliyah felt his eyes linger on her for a heartbeat longer than the others. She met his gaze steadily, refusing to shrink under the weight of it. The panelists introduced themselves in turn. Mr. Danner, the CEO, Miss Blake, the head of human resources, Mr. Levin, chief legal officer. The names blurred together in Aaliyah's mind, her nerves a taut wire beneath her skin. She could feel her wet clothes clinging to her, the mud stiffening as it dried, the scent of rain and city filth rising around her. The interviews began. Each candidate took turns answering questions, describing their achievements, their ambitions, their vision for their future at Whitmore and Lane. The polished veneer of their resumes reflected in their carefully rehearsed answers. They spoke of internships abroad, leadership roles in prestigious organizations, awards won, and accolades earned. When it was her turn, Aaliyah stood slowly, the chair creaking behind her. She set her resume gently on the table before her, smoothing it with damp, trembling fingers. Every eye in the room pinned her in place. She could have lied, could have concocted some story to excuse her appearance, spun a narrative of car trouble or last-minute catastrophe. But she didn't. She told the truth. She spoke simply, her voice low but steady, about growing up in Southside, about working 2 jobs while attending night classes. She spoke about her dreams, her determination, the sacrifices made not just by her, but by her family. And, quietly, she mentioned the woman she had helped that morning, without dramatics, without expecting pity. When she finished, the silence in the room was different. Heavier, thoughtful. Aaliyah sat down, folding her hands in her lap to still their shaking. Across the table, Mr. Danner steepled his fingers beneath his chin, his piercing gaze never leaving her face. The rest of the candidates fidgeted, exchanging uneasy glances. Some looked smug, convinced that appearances mattered more than anything. Others shifted, uncertain now. Aaliyah sat there, drenched and dirty, but unbowed. And in that stillness, she realized something profound. She had already won the most important battle. She had refused to be invisible. She had refused to give up. Whatever happened next, she had fought her way here. She had earned her place at this table, mud and all, and no one could take that away from her. The heavy silence that had fallen over the conference room lingered like a storm cloud, thick and humming with unsaid thoughts. As Aaliyah sat there, feeling the cold seep deeper into her bones through her soaked clothes, she sensed that her presence had unsettled something fundamental. It was as though her very existence at that polished, gleaming table was an affront to the order the others took for granted. She could feel it in the way glances were exchanged, in the stiff shuffle of papers, in the slight uncomfortable clearing of throats. The interviewers maintained their professional facades, but Aaliyah caught the subtle flickers of disapproval, confusion, and even irritation in their carefully neutral expressions. She knew what they saw when they looked at her. A disruption, a mistake, something that didn't belong in the flawless machinery of their world. Yet, Mr. Danner, the silver-haired CEO whose eyes seemed to bore straight through her, did not look away. He studied her with a gaze that was neither pitying nor contemptuous, but something else, something weighing and quiet, as if he were searching for something beneath the dirt and the soaked fabric. The interviews resumed, mechanical now, as if the panel struggled to reclaim the comfortable rhythm Aaliyah's story had shattered. One by one, the other candidates spoke again, answering follow-up questions with crisp precision, outlining their career plans, their polished ambitions, their meticulously crafted visions of success. Their words floated around Aaliyah like cold mist, empty and pristine, untouched by struggle or sacrifice. She sat still, hands folded neatly in her lap, resisting the urge to wipe the mud drying stiffly on her sleeves. Her heart had slowed from its earlier frantic pace, settling into a steady, stubborn beat. She belonged here. She had earned her seat not through pedigree or polish, but through something far harder to define and infinitely more valuable. When the final candidate finished speaking, the panel exchanged glances among themselves, silent communication, passing like static in the air. Mr. Danner finally leaned back in his chair, his hands steepled thoughtfully beneath his chin. For a moment, he simply regarded the room, his gaze sweeping across the array of candidates before returning inevitably to Aaliyah. "Thank you, everyone," he said, his voice low and commanding. "We'll be in touch with our decision." The candidates stood, gathering their briefcases and portfolios, their movements brisk and efficient. Some cast glances in Aaliyah's direction, pitying, derisive, or simply curious, before sweeping out of the room like a tide receding from shore. Aaliyah rose more slowly, feeling the weight of exhaustion press against her, heavier than the soaked backpack on her shoulder. As she turned to leave, Mr. Danner's voice stopped her. "Miss Thompson," he said, using her name for the first time. She turned, her heart leaping painfully against her ribs. He studied her for a long moment, his face unreadable. "Wait a moment." The panelists glanced at each other again, uncertain, but no one questioned him. The others filed out, murmuring among themselves, until only Aaliyah and Mr. Danner remained in the cavernous room. He gestured for her to sit once more. She obeyed, sinking into the leather chair with as much composure as she could muster, though every part of her ached to flee the scrutiny she was about to face. Mr. Danner leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His eyes, sharp and clear, fixed on hers without hesitation. "I want you to tell me," he said, "why you still came." The question struck her harder than any sneer or whisper had. She swallowed, feeling the roughness of her throat from the cold air and the tension coiling within her. "Because," she said quietly, "I made a promise to myself and to the people who believe in me. I couldn't break it, not for anything." He nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already suspected. His gaze softened, just slightly, a fleeting thing almost too subtle to notice. For a few long seconds neither spoke. The rain drummed faintly against the vast windows, a muted rhythm that seemed to underscore the gravity of the moment. Finally, Mr. Danner stood, smoothing the front of his jacket. "Follow me." Without waiting for her response, he moved toward a side door that led out of the conference room. Aaliyah hesitated only a second before rising to follow, her wet sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. He led her down a quieter hallway, past offices and lounges that exuded understated luxury, until they reached a small, elegantly furnished room with 2 chairs and a low table between them. It felt more personal, less staged, as though it was meant for real conversations rather than performances. He gestured for her to sit again and took the seat opposite. "I'm going to tell you a story," he said, his voice low but steady, "and then I'm going to make you an offer." Aaliyah sat rigidly, her heart thudding painfully, her hands tightening around the strap of her backpack. Mr. Danner's eyes drifted, focusing not on her but on some distant memory. 30 years ago," he began, "I walked into a bank downtown looking like I'd just crawled out from under a car, because, in a way, I had. I was working nights as a mechanic, trying to put myself through community college. I didn't have a degree. I didn't have a polished resume. Hell, I didn't even have decent shoes. I was broke, tired, and so far out of place I might as well have been invisible." A small smile, wry and tinged with sadness, crossed his lips. "The receptionist almost turned me away. And the people in that lobby," he shook his head, remembering, "they looked at me the way people sometimes look at you, like I didn't belong." He paused, meeting her gaze again. But one man saw past the dirt and the grease. He listened. He gave me a chance. And that chance changed my life. Aaliyah felt her throat tighten, emotion swirling dangerously close to the surface. "I built this company," he continued, "on the idea that we would value what mattered. Integrity, grit, heart. Somewhere along the way, I think some of us forgot that. Got caught up in appearances, in prestige, in polish." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Today, you reminded me." Aaliyah stared at him, barely breathing. "I'm offering you a position," he said simply. "It won't be glamorous at first. You'll have to work twice as hard to prove yourself. But I believe you can. I believe you already have." Tears prickled at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. She nodded once, unable to trust her voice. Mr. Danner smiled, a real smile this time, warm and proud. "Welcome to Whitmore and Lane, Miss Thompson." He stood, offering his hand. Aaliyah rose on shaking legs and took it, the firm, steady grasp grounding her in a moment that felt both impossible and inevitable. For the first time since she had stepped into the lobby, Aaliyah allowed herself to smile. Not the small, guarded smile she wore like armor, but a full, radiant smile born of triumph, relief, and fierce, unyielding hope. She had fought for this. She had bled for this. And now, against every odd, she had won. As she left the room, following Mr. Danner back through the hushed halls, she felt the shift around her. People still stared, but the nature of their gazes had changed. No longer dismissive, no longer mocking. There was curiosity now, and a glimmer of something else. Respect. Outside, the rain had begun to lighten, the first pale fingers of sunlight breaking through the heavy clouds. Aaliyah paused for a moment at the glass doors, watching the light spread across the wet pavement like a promise. The world hadn't changed. It was still hard, still unfair, still stacked against girls like her. But she had changed, and she was just getting started. The rain had slowed to a lazy drizzle by the time Aaliyah stepped out of the conference room, her heart still hammering wildly against her ribs. The hallways of Whitmore and Lane seemed quieter now, the sterile brightness of the building no longer as intimidating as it had been mere hours ago. Every step she took away from Mr. Danner's office felt heavier, weighted not by exhaustion, though she was bone-tired, but by the enormity of what had just happened. She was in. She had a place here. A foot in the door at a company that could change everything for her family and for herself. Yet the reality of where she stood, and who she still was, settled on her shoulders like a cloak she could not shrug off. She might have been offered a position, but she had not yet truly crossed the threshold into belonging. The assistant who had first greeted her was waiting near the elevator, tablet in hand, her smile as strained as it had been before. Aaliyah approached, her sodden shoes leaving a trail of muddy prints behind her, and the woman's lips tightened almost imperceptibly. "Human Resources will reach out to you with the formal offer later today," the assistant said briskly, tapping her tablet. "You should prepare to start on Monday, provided everything clears." Aaliyah nodded, her throat tight. She offered a quiet, "Thank you," which the woman barely acknowledged before turning away, her heels clicking smartly against the polished floor as she disappeared around a corner. Left alone, Aaliyah pressed the elevator button and waited, feeling the glances of passers-by brush against her like needles. She could read the silent commentary in their eyes, the disapproval, the confusion, the barely concealed disdain. It was not enough to have been offered a place. She would have to fight every day to keep it, to prove she was more than the mud on her skirt or the rain clinging stubbornly to her skin. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and she stepped inside, gripping the railing for balance as the car descended smoothly toward the lobby. Her reflection stared back at her from the mirrored walls, tired, bedraggled, but with a new light flickering deep in her dark eyes. A light that no amount of judgment could snuff out. When the doors slid open again, the lobby unfolded before her, unchanged in its glittering opulence. The same receptionist sat at her post, her expression smoothing into bland professionalism as Aaliyah passed. A group of sharply dressed employees huddled near the coffee kiosk glanced up, their conversation pausing midstream to watch her progress across the marble expanse. Their faces said everything they didn't dare voice aloud. What is she doing here? She doesn't belong. The knowledge burned, but it also steeled something inside her. Let them look. Let them whisper. Their opinions were nothing compared to the mountains she had already climbed. She walked toward the massive glass doors that led out onto the rain-slicked street, her steps slow but steady. Each stride was an act of quiet defiance, a refusal to shrink beneath the weight of expectations she had never been meant to meet. Outside, the city breathed in gray and silver, the storm clouds thinning to reveal patches of pale blue sky. The light was soft, almost tender, as it touched the wet pavement and glinted off the passing cars. Aaliyah stood for a moment under the overhang, watching the world move around her, feeling herself straddling two realities, the one she came from and the one she was stepping into. She pulled her phone from her backpack, careful not to damage the already damp device, and called her mother. The phone rang twice before the familiar, tired voice answered. "Hey, baby," her mother said, concern immediately threading through her words. "How did it go?" Aaliyah opened her mouth to answer, but for a moment no words came. The lump in her throat was too big, her emotions too raw. She closed her eyes, letting the raindrops from the overhang drip against her skin like benedictions. "I got it," she whispered finally. Silence greeted her announcement, and then her mother's voice, thick with tears, said, "I knew you would." Aaliyah pressed the phone tighter to her ear, savoring the moment, the fragile golden reality of it. She promised to call again later with details, then hung up before the dam of her emotions could break entirely. She stood there for a long minute, letting the cool air soothe her flushed cheeks. Then, drawing a steadying breath, she squared her shoulders and stepped back into the flow of the city. The next few days passed in a blur of preparations. She scoured thrift shops for a few more professional outfits, carefully laundering and pressing them until they looked as crisp as she could manage. She spent hours reviewing everything she could find about Whitmore and Lane, memorizing department structures, key executives, company culture initiatives. She wanted to be ready. She needed to be more than the girl who stumbled through the front doors soaked and muddy. She needed to be indispensable. Sunday night, she barely slept. She lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling of her bedroom, nerves fluttering in her stomach like trapped birds. Every fear, every insecurity, every harsh memory resurfaced in the darkness, but with each breath she pushed them away, replacing them with the steady rhythm of her heart, with the image of Mr. Danner's hand reaching out across the conference table. Monday morning dawned clear and bright. The storm had finally passed, leaving the air clean and sharp. Aaliyah rose before the sun, dressing with meticulous care in a simple navy dress and black flats polished until they gleamed. Her hair was neatly pulled back into a bun, her resume tucked once more into a plastic sleeve, not because she needed it today, but because it felt like armor. The journey to the office was mercifully uneventful this time. No floods, no disasters. Just the usual slow trudge of public transportation and the crush of morning commuters. When she reached Whitmore and Lane, she paused outside the glass doors, gathering herself. Inside, the lobby buzzed with life, a river of suits and briefcases and brisk determination. She walked through the doors, head high. The receptionist glanced up, recognition flickering in her eyes before she looked away without acknowledgement. Fine. Aaliyah didn't need validation from her. She made her way to the elevator, joining a cluster of employees. The chatter around her barely registered. She kept her eyes forward, her mind focused. On the 23rd floor, an HR representative was waiting to greet her. A different woman this time, younger, with an open smile that eased some of the tightness in Aaliyah's chest. They went over paperwork, benefits, company policies. The HR woman explained that Aaliyah would start in the research and development department as an assistant analyst, a position with potential for growth if she proved herself. After the onboarding formalities, Aaliyah was escorted to her new workspace, a small but tidy cubicle near the back of the R&D floor. Around her, employees moved with purpose, tapping away at computers, holding animated discussions over conference tables. No one paid her much attention, and for that she was grateful. She set down her backpack, smoothing her hands over the empty desk, and allowed herself a small, private smile. This was hers now. Not a gift, not a handout. Earned. The morning passed in a flurry of orientation materials and brief training sessions. She soaked up information like a sponge, asking smart questions, taking careful notes. She wasn't here to survive. She was here to excel. Still, the lingering stares followed her like shadows. Some subtle, some not. When she walked to the break room for a cup of coffee, conversations paused, eyes flicked toward her, then away. She caught snippets of whispered speculation. Is that the girl from the lobby? I heard she showed up looking like a disaster. Danner must be going soft. The words stung, but Aaliyah carried them the way she carried every other scar, silently, invisibly, without letting them slow her stride. During her lunch break, she sat alone at a small table by the windows, watching the city bustle below. She ate quietly, methodically, her mind already spinning through the task she needed to complete that afternoon. A few of her co-workers sat nearby, laughing over inside jokes, sharing stories of weekend trips and expensive brunches. Their world seemed so far removed from hers it might have existed on another planet. But Aaliyah didn't resent them. She didn't envy them. She was building something different, something deeper, something no one could take away from her. That afternoon, she completed her first assignment ahead of schedule, double-checked her work, and submitted it to her supervisor with a professional email. She stayed late, reviewing documents for the next project, her focus absolute. When she finally left the building, the sun was dipping low behind the skyline, painting the glass towers in hues of fire and gold. She paused on the sidewalk, lifting her face to the sky, letting the last warmth of the day wash over her. She had survived her first day. More than survived. She had planted her flag in unfamiliar soil and claimed her place. But she knew this was only the beginning. The real battles, the real tests lay ahead, and she was ready for every single one of them. The weeks that followed unfolded like a test of endurance. Each day another rung on the ladder Aaliyah had set herself to climb. Her days at Whitmore and Lane became a cycle of long hours, steep learning curves, and a steady undercurrent of silent scrutiny. She arrived before most of her co-workers and left after the office began to empty, determined to outwork every doubt that clung to her name like a shadow. At first, her presence was tolerated with a kind of brittle politeness, the sort reserved for someone whose place was questioned but not openly challenged. Conversations around her dropped to a murmur when she entered a room. Meetings skirted around her contributions, her suggestions met with nods that felt obligatory rather than engaged. She was invited to none of the casual lunches, the spontaneous coffee runs, the weekend gatherings that seemed to knit the department into a fabric from which she remained distinctly apart. Aaliyah told herself she didn't mind. She had not come to Whitmore and Lane to make friends. She had come to build a future. Still, there were moments when the weight of isolation pressed heavily against her chest. Moments when she sat at her desk, watching the easy camaraderie between her colleagues, and wondered if she would ever truly belong. She poured herself into her work, accepting every task without complaint, volunteering for assignments no one else wanted. She double-checked every report, triple-checked every presentation. She became the unseen engine that kept her team running, though few acknowledged it. Her diligence was a shield against the slights, the microaggressions disguised as jokes, the subtle underestimations. She learned quickly that excellence was her only defense, that in a world where she was judged twice as harshly, she had to be twice as good. It was during one of the department's major quarterly reviews that her chance to truly prove herself came. The team had been preparing a comprehensive market analysis for weeks, and tensions were high. The presentation would be given directly to Mr. Danner and the executive board. It was the kind of opportunity junior employees rarely touched, much less led. Yet, when the original lead analyst fell ill the night before the presentation, the department head, in a move born more of desperation than trust, turned to Aaliyah. "You've been working closely on the data," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "You can step in." There was hesitation in his voice, an unspoken question about whether she could handle it, whether she could stand before the highest levels of the company without embarrassing them all. Aaliyah felt it like a stone lodged in her throat. She nodded once, firmly. "I'll handle it," she said, her voice steady. That night, she stayed in the office until the janitorial staff began their rounds, poring over every slide, every figure, memorizing not just the content but the rhythm of the story the data told. She rehearsed in the darkened conference room, her reflection a flickering ghost in the glass walls. When she finally stumbled home, the sky was beginning to lighten, and she slept in her clothes for the few precious hours she could afford. The next morning, dressed in her best suit, a simple charcoal gray ensemble she had bought secondhand but tailored meticulously, Aaliyah stood outside the executive conference room, her palms slick with sweat, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. She could feel the eyes of her co-workers on her back, a mixture of pity, skepticism, and barely veiled curiosity. When the heavy doors opened and she stepped inside, the room seemed to stretch before her endlessly. A long, gleaming table surrounded by the highest echelons of Whitmore and Lane, each face sharp, discerning, waiting. At the head of the table sat Mr. Danner. Their eyes met briefly, and she thought she saw, just for a moment, a flicker of encouragement in his gaze. She began. Her voice, though soft at first, grew stronger as she moved through the presentation. She spoke with clarity, with precision, weaving the data into a compelling narrative of opportunity and risk. She anticipated questions before they were asked, addressed potential weaknesses without being defensive, highlighted solutions with confident pragmatism. Halfway through, she no longer heard the doubtful murmurs in her mind. She saw only the story she was telling, the path she was building with each carefully chosen word. When she finished, there was a moment of silence so profound it rang in her ears. Then Mr. Danner leaned back in his chair, a slow smile curving his lips. "Excellent work," he said, his voice carrying easily across the room. Others nodded, some begrudgingly, some with genuine surprise. The meeting moved on, but Aaliyah barely registered the transition. She had crossed an invisible line, a threshold more daunting than any doorway. She had not just survived, she had impressed. Later, in the elevator, a few colleagues who had barely acknowledged her presence before offered nods, brief smiles. Not friendship, not yet, but something closer to respect. That night, Aaliyah walked home through the city streets, the cold air sharp against her skin, and for the first time since she had stepped into Whitmore and Lane, she allowed herself a moment of pure, unfiltered pride. But the tests were not over. A few days later, the company hosted a networking event, an informal mixer intended to foster relationships across departments. Attendance was technically optional, but practically mandatory. Aaliyah hesitated, dreading the prospect of navigating a sea of small talk and subtle exclusions, but she knew she couldn't afford to be invisible. She arrived early, dressed carefully in a simple black dress and modest heels. The venue was a sleek rooftop bar, all glass and steel, the city sprawling around them in glittering lights. Clusters of employees gathered in tight circles, laughing over cocktails, their conversations a smooth blend of ambition and familiarity. Aaliyah collected a drink she didn't plan to finish and wandered the edges of the gathering, searching for an opening, a place to insert herself. She approached a group from her department, offering a polite greeting. They acknowledged her with nods, but didn't invite her into the flow of conversation. She stood awkwardly at the fringe, clutching her glass, forcing a smile she didn't feel. The minutes dragged. Just as she was considering leaving, a voice cut through the din. "Miss Thompson." Mr. Danner stood a few feet away, a drink in hand, his silver hair catching the rooftop lights. He beckoned her over, his smile genuine. Reluctantly, the group parted to let her pass. Mr. Danner introduced her to several high-level executives, casually mentioning her role in the recent presentation, praising her initiative and analytical skill. Aaliyah could feel the shift around her, the recalibration of perceptions, the subtle reassessment of her worth. It wasn't complete acceptance, but it was a beginning. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of handshakes and business cards, polite conversations and promises to connect. By the time she left, her cheeks ached from smiling, and her feet throbbed in her borrowed heels. But she carried something new within her, a sense of belonging earned, not given. When she lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, she knew that the fight would never truly end. She would always have to work harder, prove more. There would always be whispers, doubts, barriers placed where others found none. But she also knew this. She had the strength to meet those challenges head-on. She had walked through storms, through mud and judgment and isolation, and she had not broken. She would not break now. She would rise step by step, day by day, carving out a space for herself with the same relentless determination that had carried her through that rain-soaked morning and into the heart of Whitmore and Lane. The future stretched before her, uncertain, daunting, and filled with promise, and she was ready to meet it. Spring arrived in the city almost without warning, chasing away the last grudges of winter with sudden bursts of sunlight and the warm scent of blooming trees lining the sidewalks. The streets, once slick with rain and gray despair, now shimmered under a bright, forgiving sky. It was a season of renewal, of transformations whispered on every breeze, and for Aaliyah, it felt like the world outside was finally mirroring the quiet revolution stirring inside her. The changes at Whitmore and Lane were subtle at first, almost imperceptible. A nod from a senior analyst who had once looked through her, an invitation to join a brainstorming session she hadn't been expected to contribute to before. Small gestures, but they accumulated like drops of water filling a cup. The murmured gossip that had once followed her muddy footprints through the marble lobby faded, replaced by curious inquiries about her projects, her ideas. Respect, Aaliyah realized, was not gifted easily here. It was earned, and she was earning it one determined step at a time. She no longer clung to the edges of meetings, waiting to be acknowledged. She spoke up with quiet authority, presenting analyses and proposals that were lean, precise, and impossible to dismiss. She listened, too, more than she spoke, absorbing the unspoken rules of corporate survival with the same hunger she had once reserved for textbooks in the underheated corners of Southside's public library. Over time, her name became less a subject of whispers and more a point of discussion in planning meetings, attached to words like reliable, sharp, promising. There were still moments, of course. Days when a careless comment or a condescending glance would slash across her resolve like a blade. When the memory of muddy sneakers squelching across pristine marble would rear up, threatening to choke her in shame. But those moments grew fewer, and when they came, she faced them not with bitterness, but with the calm certainty that she belonged here as much as anyone else. Mr. Danner remained a quiet presence in her journey. He did not micromanage her or shield her from the harder lessons. Instead, he seemed content to let her find her own footing, offering nods of encouragement from a distance, a rare word of praise at just the moment she began to doubt herself. She respected him more for that, understanding instinctively that true mentorship was not about coddling, but about believing in someone's ability to climb even the steepest cliffs unaided. A few months into her tenure, Aaliyah was asked to lead a project team, a modest initiative compared to the massive accounts handled elsewhere in the company, but a milestone nonetheless. She assembled her team carefully, choosing a mix of cautious veterans and hungry newcomers, determined to create an environment where collaboration was valued over competition. The project, a market entry analysis for an emerging region, required late nights, countless revisions, and no small amount of political finesse. There were setbacks, of course, and moments of friction, but under her guidance the team delivered results that exceeded expectations. The recognition that followed was quieter than she had imagined, but it was real. A commendation in a department-wide meeting, a congratulatory email from a vice president, a request to mentor a new junior analyst. It was enough. More than enough. One particular afternoon, as the office buzzed with the low hum of productivity, a minor incident unfolded that brought the entire arc of her journey into sharp, aching focus. A new intern, fresh-faced and nervous, stumbled into the break room balancing a tray of coffees. A careless bump against the door frame sent the cups tumbling in slow motion, splattering their contents across the gleaming tile floor. The room fell silent, the kind of heavy, expectant silence that had once wrapped itself around Aaliyah when she had entered the lobby soaked and filthy. The intern froze, mortified, her cheeks flaming as she tried to stammer an apology, bending down awkwardly to clean up the mess with trembling hands. Without hesitation, Aaliyah set down her folder, crossed the room, and knelt beside her. "Don't worry," she said gently, offering the intern a napkin and a reassuring smile. "We all have our moments." The intern's eyes, wide with humiliation, flickered with a spark of relief. She smiled back, small and grateful. Around them, the tension in the room eased. A few others moved to help, the laughter that followed light and kind rather than cruel. Later, as Aaliyah returned to her desk, she caught Mr. Danner watching her from the glass-walled corner office. Their eyes met, and he offered a slow, approving nod. She returned it with a smile, understanding passing between them without the need for words. In that moment, she realized that her journey had come full circle. From the mud-soaked girl standing defiantly in a marble palace to the poised professional quietly shaping the culture from within, she had not just claimed a place at the table. She had changed the shape of the table itself. It wasn't just about one job or one opportunity. It was about opening a door and holding it open long enough for someone else to slip through behind her. It was about redefining success not as perfection, but as perseverance, integrity, and courage. When she stepped out of the building that evening, the air was warm against her skin, the city alive with the restless energy of early summer. She walked the familiar streets with a lighter step, her head high, her heart steady. The world was still what it was, messy, unfair, beautiful. There would still be storms ahead, battles to fight, injustices to endure. But Aaliyah knew, in a place deeper than fear, deeper than doubt, that she was ready, because in a city obsessed with polish and perfection, with spotless shoes and gleaming smiles, she had learned the most important truth of all. Character shined brighter, and sometimes, just sometimes, it left footprints on marble floors that could never be scrubbed away. She smiled to herself, a small, secret smile, and kept walking into the gathering dusk where the lights of the city blinked like 1,000 tiny promises waiting to be claimed. The story was only beginning, and this time she would be the one writing it. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more. Check out the next video and explore others on the channel. And if this moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it.